Welcome, everyone. I'm your host, Jared Bowman, and this is Biblically Speaking. And you can see that I'm joined by two friends today. To your far right, you have Kyle Pope, and then in the center, you have Bruce Reeves. These are men that I respect not only for their understanding and the way that they try to defend truth with the book of Revelation and talking about some of the false doctrines that are often forced into this book by men, but because of their work as gospel preachers as well. That I've known both of these men for several years, that I've actually gotten the chance to joke around with both of them and have lots of mutual friends in common, and I know that you're going to love them both. And so I'm going to ask them each how they're doing and let them tell you a little bit about themselves. We're going to start with Kyle. Kyle, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you. Appreciate you inviting me to be a part of this. I preach in Amarillo, Texas. Been there for 16 years and just love preaching the gospel, and have had opportunities to work with Bruce in areas of end times and eschatology. And so I'm delighted to be a part of this.
And how about you, Bruce? How you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Jared, for inviting me to be a part of this. Looking forward to this discussion. Of course, I preach for the Highway 65 congregation here in Conway, Arkansas, and have been here for 22 years. Have one son who unfortunately is almost a senior in high school. So, but it is great to be with you guys. And I have had the opportunity. Kyle has moderated for me, actually, in my most recent debate regarding 80-70 doctrine.
That's one of the reasons why I asked both of you to be on here, is because you have done a lot of work with some of the doctrines that come, I don't even want to say out of this book. These are really things that are being forced into the book. I don't know if either of you have had a chance to watch the episode with Mark Roberts yet, but Revelation is a book that the imagery is very dense, but the meaning is not really that complex. Then I would say, in a larger sense, there's also the idea that universally a reader of any time can pick up the book of Revelation and be reassured that those same kinds of struggles that they faced in the first century, maybe to a lesser degree, maybe at some point to a greater degree, that the spiritual reality of Jesus being aware and Jesus vindicating his people is no less true today than it was then. Is that a fair way of looking at the book, guys?
Yes, absolutely.
I think so. Yeah.
So when we talk about the two doctrines, and you guys threw out the word eschatology, could you tell us what eschatology is?
Sure. Greek word eschatos refers to the last or final, and it's a way essentially of talking about end times and different beliefs pertaining to end times.
Okay, so when we look at the two doctrines that we're talking about, one is the Pre-Millennialist doctrine, the other is the AD-70. We're really talking about two different ends of the spectrum there. So let me ask you two questions about each. When we talk about these two positions, when we talk about, let's start with Pre-Millennialism, what are we discussing? Kyle, you want to take that one?
Sure. It's essentially a concept that's drawn out of Revelation chapter 20, which makes reference to a 1,000-year reign. And it's basically the argument that will be an earthly reign, and that there can be things that point to that, and that there are views that will argue that there's going to be a rapture or a catching up of the saints to spare them a period of tribulation before the Lord comes and establishes a 1,000-year reign. And there are various concepts pertaining to that. And there are different kind of camps of whether they're pre-tribulation, post-tribulation, that kind of thing.
So basically, someone that's a premillennialist would look at Revelation and say, nothing in this book is finished, and that we're looking forward to events that these first century churches would have never seen.
Right. They would view it as 100% future, and that if any of it has been fulfilled, very little has, as opposed to a view that would argue that much of it has been fulfilled.
Now, Bruce, let me ask you these questions about the AD-70 doctrine. Same two questions. When we talk about the AD-70 doctrine, and we're talking about what's often called fully realized eschatology, I think hyperpreterism is another word that gets used for that. what are we talking about when somebody mentions AD 70 and a doctrine of AD 70 in relation to the book of Revelation?
Great question. I think what you're really talking about is all the promises of God were fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And of course, there's consequences of that and denial of fundamental tenets of the gospel. But that's what you're talking about. So coming out of that, you're going to have a denial of the actual return of Christ in the future, bodily resurrection, destruction of the world, etc.
To that one, let me ask this is kind of a personal question of mine, because I've dealt, not as much as you guys have, but I've dealt with both of these doctrines before. With the premillennial doctrine, I sort of get, Revelation's a big book. It's got a lot of scary imagery. You look back and you go, when was that fulfilled? And you have to really go back and look at Old Testament prophecy and see that God used this language a lot to talk about some things that would have seemed fairly normal, even if they were consequential, like wars and things like that, but they seemed fairly normal. And he's giving you this view of what's actually happening in the heavenly places kind of thing. So I sort of get why premillennialists might end up where they're at, but what, Bruce and Kyle both, what do you think is the appeal to the AD 70 doctrine? Where does this come from? Because it seems to go in a lot of different directions. Like you said, Jesus has already come. We're living past the end times now. That just doesn't seem to fit with the kind of promises that you see at the end of the book for the world that we should be living in if those things have happened.
That's a really good question as far as the appeal of the doctrine. I think there may be a couple of things depending on, the person we're dealing with. It clearly is an overreaction to the problem of premillennialism, which we all agree that's false too. It's the premillennialists tend to hyper literalize everything regarding the end of time and that kind of judgment language. What's the opposite problem in many ways with proponents of AD 70 doctrine? Where they so over spiritualize figures of speech, lose any reality they might be grounded in. So I think that's part of it. And I'm not saying this about every proponent of AD 70 doctrine, but one thing that I think we've experienced is there's a real sense of this secret knowledge that I have that you haven't figured out. And sometimes we can so oversimplify the nuances of Scripture that in order to try to sustain the doctrine, it gets real convoluted, like you said, and ends up denying things that's almost unimaginable. And I don't know if that's clear, but I think that's probably at the heart of it.
Okay. And again, that was just a personal question, because that's one that I've run into. I've discussed it with people before, but I never really have understood why they would come to that conclusion.
Well, I think you hit on the heart of it. I think there sometimes is a strain of trying to emphasize the current glory of the church. They may feel as if, we're not recognizing how wonderful it is and how much prophecy pointed to the church. And I can appreciate that. There's a real irony with it, though, sometimes, because many individuals that adopt this become very inactive in their connection to a local church. And so you kind of can't have it both ways. If you're going to try to glorify what God planned in the church, then you can't dismiss your responsibility to it.
Those are both good points. Of the two doctrines, the premillennial doctrines are probably the ones that most of our audience are going to be familiar with. They tend to pervade a lot of what's assumed to be Christianity in the West, and really the doctrines that we typically refer to as Protestant doctrines. That there's a lot of, and one of the things that I've noticed, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, either one of you, is that there seem to be at times varying degrees of premillennialism within a body of people who claim to be Christians. That some people are just expecting a rapture, and some people are expecting a rapture and a giant bloodbath. That is, of epic proportions. I mean, when you read the book of Revelation, it reads in a very cinematic kind of way. I think Mark Roberts used the example of the mural, that it seems that every time there's a war, there's a discussion of whether or not this is the return of Christ in the millennial kingdom. Prominent preachers, YouTubers, there are guys on YouTube who make a living basically selling the same video over and over and over again. This is it. I saw this sign. The market's collapsing. That's, the third writer that I saw this happen, and it's definitely this. I mean, you got guys like John Hagee and who claim to be modern prophets, that a lot of people who, because they don't understand the simple message of Revelation, they listen to these guys. Can you walk us through a timeline of what is supposed to happen if, from the premillennialist standpoint? That what is premillennialism from a timeline standpoint?
Well, one of the issues has to do with Israel and the temple in Jerusalem, because of some of the interpretations that they'll make on some of Jesus' prophecies. They'll argue the temple has to be rebuilt. They will argue that there's going to be, as Matthew chapter 24 speaks of, a period of tribulation, and they think that's a future event. And so they will believe that there will be a period of tribulation. And depending upon whether you're post-trib or pre-trib, they'll argue that some of the wording from 1 Thessalonians that speaks of saints being caught up together to meet him in the air, they think there'll be a rapture in which those that are a part of the faithful will be raptured and taken away, so they won't have to endure that tribulation. And then there are various kinds of views that will argue that there's going to be a horrible period of time that will ultimately culminate in a great battle in which Christ will ultimately be victorious. And they don't ever really resolve some of the issues with, okay, if his people have been raptured away, who's going to fight with him? Some will argue that he comes back with them for that, but they then will argue that there will be 1,000-year earthly reign, and after that will be the final coming and final destruction of the universe.
It's based on the fact that when Jesus came, he was rejected, that he was supposed to establish a kingdom. The people that he was supposed to be the king over rejected him.
It's the heart of it, because it's a concept of the kingdom that essentially argues that Jesus tried to establish it and he failed. It didn't work. They rejected him. And so the kingdom has not yet been established. And that's what the whole idea is built upon.
So I mean, you mentioned this as being the heart of the premillennial doctrine, is that the kingdom doesn't exist the way that God intended it to exist, basically. Yet Jesus tells Pilate in John 18 that my kingdom is not of this world. So it does not sound as if he thought that his kingdom failed, or that anything other than exactly what God intended to happen happened. You look at the letter to the church in Ephesus, and Paul tells them that God laid these things out before the beginning of time, before he laid the foundation of the world. All of this was planned. The image of Jesus as a sacrificial lamb was written about in Isaiah 53. All of this was planned exactly as God intended it to unfold. How do they joust with that? How do they bring all of these ideas, all of the reassurances that not just the apostles, Jesus says, this is exactly how this is supposed to unfold? How do they rectify those two positions?
Well, I think it reflects that, first century Jews had a very materialistic concept of what they were expecting the Messiah to be. And they expected one who would deliver them from Rome. And most likely, I think, premillennialism suffers from the same error. And it also fails to recognize some of the clear indicators. For Daniel chapter 2, for example, when you have the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, and you have those kingdoms that are one to follow another, and it is in the days of the fourth kingdom that the kingdom that shall never be destroyed is to be established. Now, either that happened and Christ came during the time of the Roman Empire, Or what premillennialists will have to do is they'll have to say, okay, there's going to be a revived Roman Empire, and it will be then that it is fulfilled. And that just takes Daniel chapter 2 so far out of its context.
Right. So when we look at these things, and let me open this one up to you both, what's really the appeal of premillennialism? I mean, we're talking about epic destruction if that doctrine is true.
I took some of the things Kyle was saying, just to be pointed here. It's neo-Judaistic, and I know premillennialists would object to that, but the fact is, if you have an earthly, material paradigm, if you will, regarding the kingdom and regarding these promises, which was the Jewish problem too, in large degree, you're going to end up in this place. And I also think, Jared, and you bring this up in your question, really, it's an appeal to sensationalism, which the New Testament writers describe as fleshly. And, once you give into a fleshly approach like that, it is, it's attractive to some people that want something sensational and material and tangible in that way. And some of the events that are going on, I mean, you can go back in history and see this has happened over and over and over with a premillennialist. And yet, for instance, I'll give you an example. I've got an article by a premillennialist, and he's commenting on Acts chapter 2, where it speaks of Jesus, ruling on the Messianic throne. Well, clearly he was ruling in Acts 2 on the day of Pentecost.
Right.
And yet premillennialists struggle with that. And this guy's denying that he's on the Messianic throne. And yet clearly the scripture teaches it because it would reverse his paradigm, if you will. And I think it's sensationalism.
Yeah. I mean, 1 Corinthians 15 is another one that puts really a nail in that coffin. I mean, Jesus is sitting on the throne of the whole universe, not just ruling over a Jewish nation. He's ruling over the universe, sitting on his Father's throne, waiting to sum up the last enemy, and then he hands everything back to his Father. Right. Kyle?
Well, it's a very dramatic kind of a scenario, and the very fact that you've had a series of books, the Left Behind series, that all focused on that kind of concept, that some are going to be taken and they'll disappear, and they're among those that are the saved, the chosen. That certainly is a dramatic idea. There may also be, and Bruce mentioned the neo-Judaic aspect of it. Part of their concept is they'll take Romans chapter 11, verse 26, all Israel will be saved. And they'll actually, hold to a concept that there's going to be a salvation that comes to Israel that's a little bit kind of separate and apart from simply obedience to the gospel. There's a role that they play in God's plan, even though they haven't initially accepted Jesus as the Messiah. So there's that aspect of it. And, it may just be kind of, we can respect a heritage that they hold to and yet oppose their faith. And yet I think this kind of is a way of embracing that and thinking that it's still something of value.
There are some just clear-cut things, and Jared, I think you mentioned this a minute ago as well as Kyle, passages, that don't work with this whole dispensational premillennial view. When you look at John 5, 28 and 29, resurrection of the righteous in the wicked same hour, as Kyle laid out the premillennial view, that just doesn't work with premillennialism, especially dispensationalism, or 1 Corinthians 15, where he's speaking of, the resurrection, and he says, then the end comes. Well, that doesn't fit with, the premillennial view. So you have these clear-cut passages, and then if you get into really extreme premillennialists, you even get into the restoration of the Levitical order of, Judaism. And it's not being unkind to say that's just the consequence of this. You mentioned John Hagee. He's among the most extreme. And it really undercuts the whole gospel of grace that you read in the New Testament.
And it is strange because the New Testament invests so much. And Kyle was illustrating this with the Romans 11 passage about the salvation, all Israel will be saved. And if you have to read the preceding 10 chapters to really understand what that means, because Paul is using Israel there in both a fleshly sense and a spiritual sense, and he's connecting literal people that were literally born into Jewish families with people that have accepted a faith like that Abraham had, and connecting those passages together and showing that all the promises of God are flowing out of this one tree, that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And God knew and anticipated that. But when you look at things like this, and you look at, I don't know, the entire book of Hebrews, and how much the Hebrew writer has worked to reassure us that we don't want to go back to those things, that contextually, it's just, what are some simple contexts that people could turn to that would really just lay this doctrine bare? Both of these doctrines that we're talking about today are based on taking small passages of verses or sections of verses out of Scripture and making them stand on their own. What are some passages we could turn to that would really just lay it bare?
I think Ephesians 3:10 and 11 is a significant problem because if you're viewing the church as a contingency plan B, and yet he says the church is the manifestation of the wisdom of God, and it's according to the eternal purpose of God. Game over for dispensationalism to me, because that just doesn't fit at all with how the church age and then kingdom age and all that. That just doesn't fit with how Paul is presenting in Ephesians.
I would say Colossians chapter 1, verse 13, he has delivered us from the power of darkness and conveyed us into the kingdom of the Son of his love. This rests on a concept that the kingdom has not been established. And if it was already present when Paul wrote, then that has to influence how we understand what it's talking about in Revelation chapter 20. There is a description of 1,000-year reign, but you might challenge the reader there to consider, does it ever describe Christ reigning on the earth? Those that it specifically describes reigning with him are those who had been beheaded for their testimony. So it's talking about a spiritual reign as it describes that.
And when you talk about the Christ reigning with those that had been martyred, Kyle, that really, you go back and look at the opening of the scroll. You look at the opening of the seals. And that's what the book of that's part of one of the messages of the book of Revelation, is the reassurance that those that have died are with Christ, that they've received the reward, their white robe is ready, that they will reign with him. That it's almost like we want to take all of the glory that is supposed to be post-death and resurrection, and we want to force it into earthly life. Is that a fair way of looking at this doctrine?
Yeah, I think so. What would you say, Bruce?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And that goes back to that sensational, fleshly kind of approach to things. I think the other thing, too, just from the standpoint of how we read apocalyptic literature, is a fundamental problem with this. Because, nobody's seen the passage that talks about in Revelation the 7 spirits of God and arguing, oh, well, there's literally 7 spirits in the Godhead. We understand how numbers are being used in a figurative way, in a symbolic way, but it's still real. It's conveying a message. So to come to Revelation 20 and depart from that methodology of reading Scripture of this kind, which is explicitly laid out in the book itself, that's not helpful. As we study.
Well, and it starts even before you get to chapter 20. You're over there in chapter 7 in the numbering of the 144,000. Yes. We could say that we know that 12 has been represented in the book a couple of times already by that point, particularly with the elders and their thrones. You got the 24 elders, you got 12 times 2. But it's very obvious that should be a figurative number that's representative of something, because right after that you got 12 tribes of Israel that never existed on any roster ever, because you kicked Ephraim and Dan out, probably for idolatry, I guess. but you kicked them out, and you brought in Joseph, that never was a tribe, and then you brought the Levites in as an land inheriting tribe. And it's just strange that we want to literalize certain numbers of this book. And I think it is an appeal to sensationalism or even materialism, that we like the idea of a physical kingdom and a physical king's court, in the same way that kind of puts us in the same place that the apostles were in when they were arguing about who was going to be the greatest in the kingdom, and anticipating that kind of maybe personal glory. I won't say for sure that undergirds it, but it certainly seems to be the case. And Bruce, let me let you take lead on this one. What's the harm in believing in something like the Rapture? I think, Kyle, you mentioned the Left Behind series. What's the harm in taking that in and believing in that kind of thing?
There are a couple of things. I think it is interesting when you look at the history of premillennialism, real quick, to kind of lead into this. When you look at the secret raptures, which is what I call it, because that's what they're describing, the main passage they like to go to is 1 Thessalonians 4, which speaks of a very audible, demonstrable, visible return of Christ, and it doesn't fit. Then, in addition to that, we don't really, historically, to my knowledge, you're going back to 1849 with J.N. Darby and Schofield. People probably remember the Schofield Bible, before you really start hearing about this whole secret rapture business. And so it becomes sensationalized. As far as the harm, I think it may have already been mentioned, but this whole idea that, well, if you're still living, you're going to get this second chance, which that doesn't fit at all. As we've mentioned, the materialistic, fleshly approach doesn't lead to really the life in Christ that I think we need to look at. You end up denying the faithful promises of God, misunderstanding them, deny the eternal purpose of God. So I think, and this is true of both full preterism and AD 70 doctrine and premillennialism, interestingly. When you have a wrong notion of the end of time, I think some people think, oh, this is just a kind of academic discussion, for preachers or something. No, when you have a wrong view of the end of time, what we found is it always goes all the way back to the beginning, and starts unraveling the whole.
Kyle, any thoughts?
I would add that, with the rapture, and Bruce mentioned 1 Thessalonians 4, I think you have to divorce many of the things that are described there in connection with this being caught up, if you're going to hold to one of those views, because it doesn't picture it in terms of a rapture and then all these other things continue on. It connects being caught up together with the Lord with a time when saints will always be with the Lord, the time in which he comes as a thief into chapter 5. And so you're essentially going to have to really tear some things out of that and ignore some things that are a part of it.
I mean, shouldn't Matthew 25 be a huge problem when you look at this? I mean, you go from Matthew 24 and this idea of be prepared for the return of the Lord. You roll right into Matthew 25. You get the parable of the wise and the foolish virgins, the parable of the men and the talents. You've got the judgment image there. I don't know, maybe a parable, maybe not, depending on how you define parable, I guess. But all of it seems to come down to that Jesus is judging the wicked and the righteous at the same time shortly after his return. And that this isn't, there's not a tribulation, there's not a do-over, there's not some sort of secret second chance. This is it.
Yeah, and to go with that, but of that day and hour no one knows but the Father. And so you have all this sensationalism, like you mentioned John Hagee in his book Jerusalem Countdown and all this stuff. But it, the scriptures are very clear that only the Father knows the time.
Yeah. And so it's very strange that you have two doctrines that are really based on God not doing exactly what he said he's going to do. That you've got AD 70, that's God is not presently comforting his people the way that he said he would if Jesus had already returned. And you've got, which we're about to talk about, but you've also got premillennialism, that is, God didn't establish a kingdom, and God is announcing the time that he's coming, and that coming is not going to be for judgment. It's going to be for another opportunity for those who weren't good enough, I guess, to be raptured. I mean, it's strange that a lot of people that believe in the premillennial doctrine wouldn't tell you that they believe in salvation by works, but yet the whether or not you're good enough is completely based on the works that you've done. As I understand it, that's again a very strange cognitive dissonance there of I don't believe this, but I got to do this, or else I won't get the thing that I don't believe in.